He mortgaged his own house. He walked away from the biggest show on television, and he poured tens of millions of his own dollars into a movie almost nobody wanted to watch. In just 3 years, Kevin Costner lost his marriage, his steady paycheck, and maybe a standing in Hollywood, all chasing one dream he'd been carrying for 30 years. Now, at 70 years old, he's calling this his redemption year. But is redemption still possible? Or has Kevin Costner already lost more than he can win back? Picture this. A man in his 60s, worth close to $400 million, a hit show on television, a ranch in Aspen, a mansion by the ocean, 7 kids who love him. On paper, Kevin Costner had already won. He wasn't some new face chasing fame. He'd already been there. Decades earlier, he stood on a stage holding an Oscar for Dances with Wolves. He'd starred in Field of Dreams, a movie so loved that people still quote its lines today. He'd survived one of the biggest box office disasters in Hollywood history with Waterworld, and came back stronger anyway. Costner wasn't just an actor. He was proof that you could fall down in this industry and still get back up. And then, in the 2010s, he found a new peak. He joined a show called Yellowstone, playing a tough, weathered rancher named John Dutton. The show became a phenomenon. Millions of people tuned in every week. Costner was, once again, one of the biggest names on television. But here's the thing about a man who has already climbed a mountain once. He starts looking for a bigger one, because underneath all that success, Costner was carrying something else. A dream he'd been holding on to quietly for over 30 years. Not a script he'd just found. Not a role someone offered him. Something he'd written himself, rewritten, and refused to let go of long before Yellowstone ever existed. Most people would let a 30-year-old dream fade away. Costner didn't. He was about to risk almost everything he'd built to finally make it real. His money, his marriage, his biggest television role. All of it was about to be put on the line for one project he believed in more than anything else. What was this dream that a 70-year-old Hollywood legend was willing to gamble his whole life on? That's where our story really begins. 30 years is a long time to hold on to anything. A job, a relationship, a dream. But Kevin Costner held on to this one for longer than some marriages last. The dream was called Horizon, a sweeping story about the American West after the Civil War. Costner didn't just want to star in it. He wanted to write it, direct it, and shape every piece of it himself. He'd been sketching out this story since long before Yellowstone made him a household name all over again. Here's what made it different from every other project in his career. Hollywood studios kept saying no. Think about that for a second. This was a man with an Oscar, a man who had already proven he could direct a hit with Dances with Wolves. And still, studio after studio turned him down. They didn't believe a 4-part Western epic could make its money back in today's market. Westerns, they told him, were a hard sell now. Audiences wanted superheroes and sequels, not stories about wagon trains and frontier towns. Most actors would have taken the hint. Costner didn't. Instead, he did something almost nobody in his position does anymore. He decided to fund it himself, not with a small chunk of his savings. He put around $38 million of his own money into getting the first films made. He even mortgaged his own home to help make it happen. Think about that. A movie star with hundreds of millions of dollars still felt the need to risk his own house on a story he believed in. Why would a man who had nothing left to prove take a risk like that? Maybe it wasn't about proving anything to Hollywood at all. Maybe it was personal. This wasn't a script handed to him by a studio executive chasing a trend. This was his story, one he'd been building in his head for 3 decades, waiting for the moment he finally had the power and the money to make it happen exactly the way he wanted. But there was a problem. A 4-part Western epic doesn't get made overnight. It needs time. Months and months of filming, editing, and planning. And Costner already had a full-time job. He was still playing John Dutton on Yellowstone, one of the biggest shows on television. Something had to give. And soon, Costner would have to make a choice that would shock fans, frustrate his own show's creator, and set off a chain of events that would follow him for years. He was about to walk away from the very show that made him a star again. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why would anyone walk away from the biggest show on television? Yellowstone wasn't just popular, it was a phenomenon. Millions of viewers every single week. Costner, as John Dutton, was the face of it, the anchor, the reason a lot of people tuned in at all. Walking away from that kind of role isn't just risky, it's the kind of decision that can end a career instead of extend it. But behind the scenes, something wasn't right. Reports began surfacing about tension between Costner and the show's creator, Taylor Sheridan. According to sources close to production, Costner felt like he understood what made the show feel real and authentic. But Yellowstone was Sheridan's creation, his baby, as one insider put it. And when the star of a show starts wanting more creative control over a project that belongs to someone else, cracks start to form. There was reportedly a power struggle. Costner became distant from the rest of the cast. He stopped interacting with them off camera, only showing up when it was time to film his scenes. The warmth that once existed on set seemed to fade. Meanwhile, Horizon needed him. Filming a 4-part Western epic takes an enormous amount of time, and Costner's schedule simply couldn't stretch far enough to cover both projects. Something had to be sacrificed, and in the end, it was Yellowstone. Costner's time on the show came to an end, and it didn't happen quietly. Fans were left stunned. Headlines speculated about feuds and fallouts. And for the first time in years, the man who seemed untouchable was suddenly the center of controversy instead of praise. Here's the part that makes this moment sting even more. Looking back, Costner walked away from a guaranteed hit, one of the biggest and most talked about shows in the country, to chase a project that Hollywood studios had already rejected. A dream nobody else believed in as much as he did. At the time, some people admired the boldness of it. Here was a man in his 60s, willing to bet everything on his own vision instead of coasting on a role that was already working. Others weren't so sure. They wondered if Costner was making a mistake that could cost him everything he'd rebuilt. Nobody knew yet just how expensive that gamble was about to become. Because walking away from Yellowstone was only the beginning. The real risk was still ahead of him. Costner was about to sink millions more into a project that could either cement his legacy forever or become the biggest financial disaster of his career. By the time Horizon, an American saga, reached theaters in the summer of 2024, Kevin Costner had already given everything to it. His time, his money, his house, mortgage to help pay for it. Now came the moment of truth. Would audiences show up? At the Cannes Film Festival, something beautiful happened first. Costner debuted the film to a standing ovation that lasted almost 10 minutes. People in the crowd were on their feet, applauding a project that had taken him 3 decades to bring to life. Costner, by most accounts, was overcome with emotion. For a moment, it looked like the gamble was going to pay off. But Cannes is not the box office. And the box office tells a different, much colder story. When Horizon hit theaters, it struggled badly. It became one of the biggest box office disappointments of 2024. Not just a disappointing opening weekend, a financial disaster that industry insiders were calling one of the worst flops of the year. Think about what that actually meant for Costner personally. This wasn't studio money he lost. This was his own money. $38 million of it, on top of a mortgaged house. A man who once had an estimated net worth of around $400 million was suddenly staring at a project that had drained a huge chunk of his fortune and returned almost nothing. And here's the part that made it even harder to swallow. Horizon was never meant to be one movie. It was designed as a 4-part saga. Costner had planned to keep filming, keep releasing chapters, and build out the entire story he'd been dreaming about since long before Yellowstone ever existed. But after the box office numbers came in, everything slowed down. Plans for future chapters became uncertain. A source close to the project later described it bluntly, saying there was a structure partly built for future filming, but essentially nothing happening on it anymore. Costner didn't hide from the criticism completely. He defended the film publicly, pushing back against what he called dismissive critics. But defending a project and recovering the money you lost on it are two very different things. Here's what makes this moment in Costner's story so painful. He didn't fail because he wasn't talented. He didn't fail because nobody wanted to work with him. He failed because he bet everything on his own vision in a market that had already warned him it wasn't ready for it. And the timing could not have been worse. Because while Horizon was falling apart at the box office, something else in Costner's life was already falling apart too. Something that had nothing to do with movies or money or Hollywood at all. His marriage was ending, and it was about to become just as public and just as painful as everything happening on screen. While Costner was pouring everything into Horizon, his marriage was quietly falling apart home. In May 2023, his wife Christine Baumgartner filed for divorce, ending an 18-year marriage. They had 3 children together and had built a life that, from the outside, looked stable and happy. But behind closed doors, something had already broken. What followed wasn't a quiet, private separation. It became a public court battle, stretched out over months, with lawyers on both sides making accusations and official filings. Baumgartner's legal team raised questions about whether Costner had been faithful during the marriage. Costner's side pushed back, claiming Baumgartner had inflated her child support request to cover the cost of plastic surgery. None of it was quiet. All of it played out where the public could watch. By September 2023, the 2 sides reached a settlement, avoiding a full trial. But the emotional damage was already done. And Costner wasn't shy about admitting just how much it hurt him. He described the divorce as a crushing moment, not a quiet ending. A blow. He told one interviewer it was powerful and that it hurt, but that he had no choice except to keep moving forward, because his children were watching him and depending on him. Here's what makes this part of the story especially hard. Costner wasn't just losing a marriage. He was losing it at the exact same time his life's biggest passion project was collapsing at the box office. 2 of the most important things in his life, his family and his life's work, were falling apart during the very same year. And there was one more detail that made the divorce sting even more. Baumgartner soon moved on, eventually marrying a man named Josh Connor, someone who had actually been Costner's own financier at one point. For a man already dealing with public humiliation over his finances, watching his ex-wife build a new life with someone connected to his own business dealings must have felt like salt in an already open wound. Costner later admitted that navigating co-parenting after everything that happened wasn't easy. He said there were no real winners in a divorce like this. Just 2 people trying to survive something that unraveled far quicker than either of them expected. By the time 2024 came to a close, Kevin Costner had lost his marriage, sunk a fortune into a movie that flopped, and walked away from the biggest show on television. 3 massive pieces of his life, all crumbling within the same short window of time. But surprisingly, this still wasn't the end of his troubles. Because just as things seemed like they couldn't get worse, new legal battles were about to appear. Battles that had nothing to do with his marriage, and everything to do with money he thought was already settled. Just when it seemed like Kevin Costner had already lost enough, the legal trouble kept coming. The first blow came from the people he trusted with money. Financial backers connected to Horizon claimed that Costner's team had gone back on agreed terms during the project. It turned into a legal dispute that put more of Costner's fortune at risk, on top of everything he had already spent and lost. For a man once worth close to $400 million, reports suggested his savings were now being drained from multiple directions at once. The divorce, the box office flop, and now, a legal fight over money tied directly to the project he'd sacrificed so much for. But the second lawsuit was even more serious. A stunt performer who had worked on Horizon, an American Saga Chapter 2, filed a complaint against Costner and the production companies behind the film. According to her allegations, she was asked to perform an unplanned, unscripted intimate scene during filming in 2023, something she says she never agreed to. She is seeking damages and has requested a trial by jury. Costner's legal team responded firmly, denying the claims completely. His lawyer stated publicly that Costner always wants everyone comfortable working on his films, and that safety on set is something he takes seriously. The legal team called the allegations meritless. Here's the important thing to understand about lawsuits like this one. Nothing has been proven in court. Claims made in a legal filing are accusations, not established facts, until a judge or jury reaches a decision. But even an unresolved lawsuit carries weight. It generates headlines. It raises questions. And for a public figure already fighting to rebuild his reputation, it added yet another layer of uncertainty to an already difficult chapter of his life. Think about the timeline here for a moment. Divorce, box office failure, financial disputes, now a serious lawsuit involving his own film set. Each one on its own would be a hard year for anyone. Costner was facing all of them, stacked one on top of another, in the span of just a few short years. Sources close to him described him as devastated after reading critical coverage about his situation, saying he cared more than he let on publicly, even if he rarely engaged with the press directly. Another insider claimed the negative headlines had been eating away at him quietly, even while he tried to project calm on the outside. By this point, the question wasn't just whether Horizon would ever get its remaining chapters made. The bigger question had become something much more personal. Was there any way back for Kevin Costner at all? Or had the dream he chased for 30 years finally cost him more than he could ever recover? That question brings us to where Costner stands right now, and what he himself is calling a turning point. So here's where the story stands right now. Kevin Costner, 70 years old, a divorce behind him, a financial gamble that didn't pay off the way he hoped, lawsuits still hanging over his name, and a career that, according to people close to him, has quieted down in ways it never used to. But here's the twist in this story that a lot of people miss. Costner isn't hiding. He isn't disappearing. According to sources close to him, he's been telling his inner circle something surprising. He's calling 2026 his redemption year. Think about the way of that phrase. Redemption isn't something you claim when you're comfortable. It's something you reach for when you've truly fallen, and you're choosing to climb back up anyway. Costner, by all accounts, knows exactly how far he's fallen. And instead of quietly fading into retirement with his fortune and his memories, he's reportedly plotting his way back into the spotlight, including talk of a major new role in a political drama series. There's something else worth mentioning here too. Amid all this chaos, Costner found a new relationship. Reports describe his connection with Kelly Noonan Gores as calm, private, and grounding, a quiet contrast to the very public storm of his divorce. He said be taking things slow this time, careful not to repeat the same painful chapter twice. So what's the real lesson buried inside this story? Maybe it's this. Kevin Costner didn't lose everything because he made a foolish decision. He lost a huge amount because he refused to let go of a dream that mattered to him more than comfort, more than a steady paycheck, and more than staying safely inside a role that was already working. He bet on himself in an industry that told him no again and again, and that bet cost him his marriage, a large piece of his fortune, and years of public struggle. But it didn't cost him everything. He still has his children. He still has his name. He still has, by his own admission, something inside him that refuses to quit chasing what he believes in. Whether Horizon ever gets its remaining chapters, whether the lawsuits resolve in his favor, whether this redemption year actually becomes real, or just another headline that fades away, nobody can say for certain yet. But one thing is clear. Kevin Costner has been counted out before, and more than once, he's climbed back onto the screen anyway, a little older, a little more bruised, but still riding toward whatever comes next. Do you think Kevin Costner still has one real comeback left in him? Or has Hollywood already moved on for good? Let me know in the comments below. Let's go back to something we touched on earlier, because the real story behind Costner's Yellowstone exit is stranger and messier than most fans ever realized. On the surface, everyone assumed it was simple. Costner was busy with Horizon. He didn't have time for both. Case closed. But insiders tell a more complicated story. One about two strong-willed creators who couldn't share the same vision. Taylor Sheridan built Yellowstone from nothing. It was his world, his characters, his voice. And for years, that arrangement worked. But as the show grew into a cultural phenomenon, Costner reportedly started feeling like his experience, his decades in westerns, his instinct about what felt authentic, deserved more weight in the room. Sources close to production described a quiet but real power struggle. Not shouting matches. Something colder. Distance. Costner allegedly stopped engaging with the cast off camera. He'd arrive, film his scenes, and leave. People who once considered him a mentor on set said he became someone they barely recognized socially. Even while his character John Dutton remained the emotional center of the show. Here's the part that stings the most for fans. The show's final chapter, the one meant to give John Dutton a proper goodbye, never happened the way anyone expected. Costner's storyline was left dangling. Rumors swirled for months about assault accusations involving a castmate, disputes over his shooting schedule, and disagreements over how his exit would even be written. Later, Sheridan addressed the rumors publicly, attempting to set the record straight about what actually happened between them. But by then, the damage to the friendship and to Costner's image as a team player was already done. What does this tell us about Costner, the man behind the legend? Maybe that 30 years of being the guy who calls the shots on his own projects made it hard for him to just be an actor taking direction again, even on the biggest show of his career. And that instinct, the refusal to just go along with someone else's vision, is the exact same trait that built Horizon. The same strength that made him a legend also cost him one of the best roles of his later career. Was walking away from Yellowstone pride, principle, or something else entirely? That question still doesn't have a clean answer. Here's something people forget about Kevin Costner. This isn't the first time he stood on the edge of career disaster. In fact, this might be the third time. Rewind to 1995. Costner was riding high off Dances with Wolves, an Oscar-winning triumph that made him one of the most respected names in Hollywood. Then came Waterworld, a massive, expensive gamble set on a flooded future Earth. It became one of the most infamous box office disasters in movie history at the time. Critics mocked it. Industry insiders whispered that Costner's career was finished. He didn't quit. He kept working, kept taking roles, kept believing that one flop couldn't define 30 years of work. And eventually, he was right. He rebuilt. He found new hits. He found Yellowstone decades later, proving a comeback was possible even after people had counted him out. Now think about that pattern. A big, bold, expensive gamble. A public failure. Whispers that his career is over. And then, eventually, a return. It happened with Waterworld. Now it's happening again with Horizon. Here's what makes this repeat pattern fascinating, instead of just sad. Most actors who get burned once by an expensive failure become cautious. They stop taking big swings. They play it safe for the rest of their careers. Costner never learned that lesson, and maybe he never wanted to. Friends and colleagues have long described him as stubborn in the most particular way. Not stubborn about small things. Stubborn about vision. He doesn't chase trends. He chases stories he personally believes matter, even when the numbers say otherwise, even when the studios say no, even when it costs him millions of his own dollars. It's the same quality that got him mocked after Waterworld, the same quality that pushed him to mortgage his house for Horizon, the same quality that made him distant on the set of Yellowstone, because compromise has never come naturally to him. Is that reckless? Maybe. But it's also the exact reason Kevin Costner is still a headline 30 years after his first supposed career-ending disaster, while most of his peers from that era have quietly faded away. The question now is whether this particular pattern is about to repeat itself one more time. Because if history really does repeat for Costner, then his redemption year might not just be wishful thinking. Let's talk about the money for a moment, because the numbers here tell their own quiet story. At his peak, Costner was reportedly worth close to $400 million. That's the kind of wealth most people can't fully imagine. Homes on both coasts. A ranch in Aspen spanning over 160 acres. A bluff-top estate in Santa Barbara overlooking the ocean. By any normal measure, financial security should have been the one thing Costner never had to worry about. But wealth like that isn't as untouchable as it looks from the outside. Between the divorce settlement, years of child support payments for his youngest 3 children, the $38 million sunk into Horizon, the mortgage taken out on his own property, and now legal fees tied to multiple lawsuits, reports suggest his financial cushion has been shrinking from several directions at once. One insider close to the situation put it bluntly, describing the Horizon experience as something that bled money out of him without much to show for it in return. There were even reports suggesting Costner might eventually need to sell off some of his most valuable properties just to stay financially steady. Picture that for a moment. A man who spent decades building an empire of land, homes, and investments, potentially having to give pieces of it up, not because he lost his talent or his fame, but because of a series of very personal, very public decisions made over just a few short years. Here's what makes this part of the story land differently than a typical celebrity financial scare. Costner didn't lose his money through bad luck or scandal outside his control. He chose every step of it. He chose to fund Horizon himself instead of waiting for a studio. He chose to walk away from Yellowstone. He chose to fight in court rather than settle quietly and quickly. Every dollar lost traces back to a decision he made on purpose, believing it was worth the risk. That raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If you had almost $400 million and the freedom that comes with it, would you have played it safe? Or would you have bet it all on a dream nobody else believed in, the same way Costner did? His answer to that question has already cost him a fortune, but it hasn't stopped him yet. And that leads us to the final piece of this story, the part where we find out what Costner actually has left and whether it's enough to build his way back. So after everything, the divorce, the lawsuits, the flop, the fortune drained from multiple directions, what does Kevin Costner actually have left standing? More than you might think. He still has his name. And in Hollywood, a name built over 5 decades still opens doors that money alone cannot. He still has an Oscar on his shelf that nobody can take away, no matter how Horizon performs at the box office. He still has 7 children across 3 different relationships. Children he has repeatedly called a true anchor of his life, the thing that keeps him moving forward even when everything else feels like it's collapsing. He still has a new relationship that, by most accounts, feels different this time. Quieter, slower, built on walks on the beach and dinners at home instead of red carpets and headlines. Maybe that's exactly what a man who just survived his most public storm actually needs. And he still has that same stubborn belief in his own vision, the very thing that cost him so much, but also the very thing that turned Waterworld from a career-ending disaster into a forgotten footnote 30 years later. Here's the real truth sitting underneath this entire story. Kevin Costner didn't fall because he was foolish or careless. He fell because he refused to play it safe at a stage in his career when playing it safe would have been the easiest thing in the world to do. He had nothing left to prove to anyone, and he risked it all anyway, on a story that mattered to him more than his bank account, more than a hit television show, and maybe even more than the comfort of his own marriage. That is either the most reckless decision of his life, or the bravest one. Maybe, honestly, it's both at the same time. Right now, Costner is standing exactly where he stood after Waterworld all those years ago. Bruised, talked about, underestimated. And history says that's precisely the position he's most dangerous in. Whether 2026 truly becomes his redemption year is still unwritten. Nobody, not even Costner himself, knows for certain how this next chapter ends. Do you think Kevin Costner's gamble on Horizon was worth everything he lost, or did he make one of the biggest mistakes of his career? Let me know in the comments below. To understand why this man refuses to play it safe, even now at 70, we need to go back to the very beginning, long before the Oscars, long before the ranches and the mansions, back to a kid who almost never made it into movies at all. Costner was born in 1955 in Linwood, California, the youngest of 3 sons. His father worked for an electric company, moving the family from town to town for the job. That kind of childhood, always a new kid, never quite settled, reportedly left Costner feeling like an outsider for years. He's talked about being a shy, awkward teenager, someone who didn't exactly seem destined for movie stardom. He went to college planning to study marketing and business, about as far from Hollywood as you can get. But somewhere along the way, a chance encounter changed everything. The story goes that a young Costner, newly married and unsure of his path, sat next to actor Richard Burton on a flight. That conversation reportedly lit something in him. Soon after, he made a decision his practical, business-minded family didn't fully understand. He was going to chase acting instead. It wasn't an easy climb. Costner worked odd jobs, took small roles, and faced the kind of rejection that breaks most people before they ever get close to success. There's a well-known story about his very first real movie role. In The Big Chill, a role that was almost entirely cut from the final film. Imagine that, getting your first real shot, and watching it vanish before audiences even saw it. Most people would have quit right there. Costner didn't. He kept auditioning, kept taking meetings, kept believing, the same stubborn belief that would define every major decision for the rest of his life. And slowly, the roles got bigger. Until one day, a Western about a soldier who befriends a Native American tribe landed on his desk. A passion project nobody in Hollywood wanted to fund. Sound familiar? That project was Dances with Wolves. And it would either end his career before it really started, or turn him into a legend. Here's something almost nobody remembers about Dances with Wolves. Before it became an Oscar-winning masterpiece, Hollywood called it something else entirely. A disaster waiting to happen. Think about the pitch. A 3-hour Western. Long stretches of dialogue in the Lakota language with subtitles. A slow, quiet story about a Civil War soldier who leaves everything behind to live among a native tribe. Studios took one look and passed. Westerns were considered dead box office in the late 1980s. And a first-time director wanting 3 hours and subtitles felt, to most executives, like career suicide. Costner didn't just want to star in it. He wanted to direct it too, something almost unheard of for an actor at a stage of fame. Industry insiders reportedly nicknamed the project Kevin's Gate, a cruel reference to Heaven's Gate, a famously expensive Western flop from years earlier that had nearly destroyed a major studio. People weren't just doubting the movie. They were predicting it would end Costner's career before it truly began. Sound familiar yet? Just like he would decades later with Horizon, Costner refused to back down. He fought for the film. He fought for its length. He fought to keep the Lakota language and subtitles instead of simplifying the story for a wider audience. He believed the film needed to be told with respect and patience, even if that made it a harder sell. And then, against every prediction, everything changed. Dances with Wolves was released in 1990 to stun audiences and critics. It went on to win 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Costner himself, a first-time director, a supposedly dead genre, a 3-hour subtitle Western. It shouldn't have worked. It became one of the defining films of its decade. Here's the important part. This wasn't beginner's luck. This was the exact same formula Costner would return to again and again for the rest of his life. Believe in a story nobody else believes in. Fund it. Fight for it, direct it his way, risk everything on his own vision, instead of trusting someone else's judgment. It worked spectacularly the first time. Years later, with Waterworld, it nearly destroyed him. And decades after that, with Horizon, it cost him his marriage and a fortune. Same man, same instinct, different outcome every single time, which raises the real question sitting at the center of this entire documentary. Is Kevin Costner a visionary who occasionally gets unlucky, or a gambler who happened to win big once early and has been chasing that same high ever since? There's a side to Kevin Costner's story that rarely gets the same attention as the box office numbers and the lawsuits. His family. And it's more complicated than most fans realize. Costner has 7 children, spread across 3 separate relationships. His first marriage was to Cindy Silva, his college sweetheart, someone he was with long before fame ever entered the picture. Together, they had 3 children. That marriage ended in divorce in the mid-1990s, right around the same turbulent period when Waterworld was nearly sinking his career at the same time. Then came a relationship with Bridget Rooney, which resulted in a son, born in the late 1990s. And finally, his marriage to Christine Baumgartner, the one that dominated headlines during the recent divorce, gave him 3 more children, all born after the age of 45. Here's what makes this worth pausing on. Costner has spoken publicly more than once about trying to break a pattern, about wanting to be a different kind of father than the one he grew up with, someone who was, by his own account, often away for work. He's talked about making an effort to show up at his younger children's sports games and school events, even during the most chaotic periods of his career. But building a stable family across 3 different relationships, spanning multiple decades, comes with its own quiet complications. Different kids at different ages. Different mothers with different needs and expectations. A public divorce that played out in courtrooms while his youngest children were still watching from the sidelines. Costner has said the hardest part of the recent divorce wasn't the financial fallout or the headlines. It was watching his youngest kids process something so painful, so publicly, at ages when they were far too young to understand any of it. He's described trying to shield them from the noise, while also being honest with them about what was happening. Here's the quiet irony sitting underneath this entire family story. A man who built his career telling stories about family, about legacy, about fathers and sons, in movies like Field of Dreams and Yellowstone, has spent much of his real life trying to hold his own family together across 3 very different chapters. And now, at 70, with a new relationship that people close to him describe as calmer and more private, Costner appears to be trying something he's never quite managed before, slowing down enough to actually be present, instead of chasing the next dream. Whether that's truly possible for a man built entirely around chasing dreams is still an open question. So, where does Kevin Costner actually stand right now in the eyes of the industry that made him? The honest answer is complicated. Insiders describe a mixed picture. Some studio executives reportedly still see him as a financial risk after Horizon, someone whose passion projects come with too much baggage and too much cost. Casting decisions that once would have been automatic are now, according to sources close to the industry, being weighed more carefully. But there's another side to this. Because respect and bankability aren't always the same thing in Hollywood, directors and actors who worked alongside Costner continue to speak about him with genuine admiration, describing him as someone who treats a film set with seriousness and dedication that's become rare. Younger actors who grew up watching Dances with Wolves and Field of Dreams still consider working with him a milestone, regardless of how Horizon performed. And then there's the audience itself, the people ultimately deciding whether a comeback is even possible. Public sentiment online tend to split into 2 camps. Some see a man in his 70s still swinging for something meaningful, still willing to risk everything for a story instead of coasting toward retirement, and they respect that deeply. Others see stubbornness dressed up as vision, a man who refused good advice one too many times and is now paying the price for his own ego. Both of those readings can be true at once. That's what makes Costner's story genuinely different from a simple rise and fall. Here's the revelation sitting at the very center of everything we've covered. Kevin Costner's entire career has been built on the exact same gamble, played over and over across 5 decades. Bet everything on a story nobody else believes in. Risk his money, his relationships, even his reputation, on his own vision instead of someone else's blueprint. Sometimes, like with Dances with Wolves, that bet turns him into a legend. Sometimes, like with Waterworld and now Horizon, it nearly breaks him. The pattern never changes. Only the outcome does. And that's why nobody, not the studios, not the critics, not even the people closest to him, can confidently predict what happens next. Because Costner has never once played it safe long enough for anyone to know what safe would even look like for him. Maybe that's the real story here. Not a man who fell from grace. A man who has spent his entire life walking a tightrope of his own choosing. One he built himself. One nobody asked him to walk. Sometimes he lands on the other side of legend. Sometimes he falls hard. But he never stops walking it. So here's the real question this story leaves behind. Do you think Kevin Costner's refusal to play it safe is what makes him one of Hollywood's last true risk-takers? Or has that same stubbornness finally cost him more than he'll ever get back? Let me know in the comments below. Let's rewind to a single moment that captures the strange split between Costner the artist and Costner the businessman. Cannes Film Festival, May 2024. When Horizon premiered on that stage, something remarkable happened. The crowd rose to its feet. The applause didn't stop after a minute, or 2, or 5. It stretched close to 10 minutes, an eternity in film festival terms. Cameras caught Costner visibly emotional, wiping his eyes, turning to hug people around him. For a man who had spent 3 decades chasing this exact moment, it looked, for one night, like total vindication. Critics were largely warm too. Many praised the ambition of it, the sweeping scope, the patience of a filmmaker willing to tell a slow story in an industry obsessed with speed. Some called it a return to old-fashioned, grown-up filmmaking, the kind Hollywood barely makes anymore. Here's the part that makes the story almost tragic. None of that mattered once the film reached ordinary theaters. Festival audiences are not the same as opening weekend audiences. Festival crowds are curated, patient, and full of people who deliberately chose to sit through a 3-hour Western epic because they love cinema. Regular moviegoers, the ones buying tickets on Friday night, wanted something faster. Something with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Horizon was designed as the first of 4 chapters, meaning it deliberately left its story unfinished, betting that audiences would return for the sequel. They didn't return. The numbers were brutal enough that plans for the remaining chapters were quietly shelved. Think about the whiplash of that. 10 minutes of a standing ovation from the exact audience Costner had spent his whole career trying to impress, immediately followed by box office numbers cold enough to threaten his family's finances. 2 completely different verdicts on the same film, delivered within weeks of each other. Costner has talked about this contrast himself, admitting that the ovation meant everything to him personally, even while the commercial failure meant almost as much financially. Both things were true. The film succeeded as art. It failed as a business. And in Hollywood, only one of those 2 verdicts actually pays the mortgage. Section 17. The friends who stayed and the ones who didn't. When someone's life falls apart this publicly, you find out fast who actually stays. Reports from people close to Costner during this period describe a noticeably quieter phone. Invitations that used to come easily started slowing down. Some of that was simple industry math. Executives distancing themselves from a name currently associated with a box office disaster. Hollywood has never been sentimental about failure, no matter how respected you once were. But there's another side to this that's easy to miss in the headlines. Several longtime collaborators reportedly stuck by him through all of it. Actors who worked with him decades ago on Dances with Wolves and Field of Dreams have continued speaking about him warmly in interviews, describing a level of loyalty and mentorship that doesn't disappear just because a film underperforms. One frequent detail that comes up in interviews with crew members who worked on Horizon is how personally invested Costner remained on set, reportedly checking in with lower-level crew members by name, something not every A-list star bothers doing. That detail matters, because it complicates the easy narrative. It would be simple to paint Costner purely as a stubborn man whose ego cost him everything. But the people who actually worked beside him during the worst of it tend to describe someone different. Someone who stayed present, stayed kind, and kept showing up on set even as his personal life and finances were unraveling in public. His children, by most accounts, became his steadiest anchor during this stretch. Interviews from this period show him repeatedly redirecting questions about the divorce and the lawsuits back toward his kids, saying they were the reason he kept getting up every morning, even when nothing else in his life felt certain. And then there's Kelly Noonan Gores, the relationship that reportedly grew during this exact period of upheaval. People close to Costner describe her as someone who entered his life without the noise of Hollywood attached, a documentary filmmaker in her own right, someone who understood the industry without needing anything from his fame. Sources say the relationship gave him something he hadn't had in years, a version of normal. Here's what this section of the story really reveals. Losing almost everything doesn't just cost you money or headlines. It tests every relationship you have and quietly sorts them into 2 categories. The ones built on your success and the ones built on you. Costner, by most accounts, learned exactly which category each of his relationships fell into. And that knowledge, painful as it was to gain, may end up being worth more to him long-term than anything Horizon ever could have earned at the box office. Section 18. What this story really teaches US. So here we are, 18 sections deep into the life of a man most people thought they already understood. Kevin Costner isn't easy to sum up in one sentence. He's not simply a fallen star, and he's not simply a misunderstood genius either. He's something messier and more human than either of those labels. A man who built an entire life and rebuilt it more than once around a single unshakable belief that some stories are worth risking everything for, even when every expert in the room is telling you otherwise. That belief made him an Oscar winner at 35. It nearly ended his career at 40. It made him one of television's biggest stars again in his 60s. And it cost him his marriage, a huge portion of his fortune, and years of public scrutiny in his 70s. Here's the thing worth sitting with as this story closes. We tend to want clean endings. Either the hero wins or the hero falls. But Costner's life doesn't fit that shape. He's fallen publicly more than once and climbed back publicly more than once. The pattern itself is the story. Not one single flop. Not one single triumph. The willingness to keep betting on himself, decade after decade, regardless of the outcome last time. Maybe that's actually the most honest kind of legacy a person can leave behind. Not a perfect record, a consistent character, the same instincts, the same stubbornness, the same refusal to play it safe, showing up again and again across 50 years. Sometimes rewarding him, sometimes punishing him, but never once changing who he fundamentally is. Whatever happens with the remaining Horizon chapters, whatever happens in the lawsuits still working their way through courts, whatever redemption year ends up actually meaning for him, one thing already seems certain. Kevin Costner will keep making the same kind of bet he's always made. His own vision against the odds, no matter cost. Some people will call that wisdom. Others will call it flaw he never learned to fix. Perhaps, in the end, it's simply who he is, unwilling to be anyone else. Do you think Kevin Costner's refusal to compromise is his greatest strength, or the one flaw that's cost him everything? Let me know in the comments below.